Hey everyone, my name is Eric Manning, and you are watching Sunday School Apologetics, and today we are asking the question, would the Gospel authors pass or flunk a Palestinian geography test? Why is this important? Well, here's a skeptical argument. If the Gospels were trustworthy historical documents, they wouldn't contain serious geographical errors. But, skeptics will say, the Gospels do, in fact, contain numerous geographical errors, serious ones. Therefore, the Gospels are not trustworthy as historical documents. One example that skeptics will cite is Mark 7:31. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. Well, here's a map, and it's a bit strange that they would go north and then south, and why wouldn't they take a more direct route? Dennis Nineham, a skeptical New Testament scholar, says this shows that the evangelist was not directly acquainted with Palestine. Ouch. Well, here is a topographical map, and you can take a look at this for just a moment here, and you see Mount Morone and the terrain a little bit. And this is Tim McGrew, who is a noted philosopher of religion and epistemology, and he teaches at Western Michigan. He's also a walking encyclopedia on all things historical apologetics. And he says that any topographical map will show that there is a mountain, Mount Morone, 3/4 of a mile high directly between Tyre and the Sea of Galilee. But there is a pass from Sidon through the mountains to the Jordan River Valley where foot travelers to Galilee could have fresh water for the journey. Well, that would make a whole lot of sense to go out of your way on a longer trek in order to have fresh water. So this particular objection just doesn't really work. Here's another one that skeptics use. Mark 11:1. Now when they drew near to Jerusalem, to Bethphage and to Bethany, at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 of his disciples. Well, here's Randall Helms, another skeptical New Testament scholar, and he says that anyone approaching Jerusalem from Jericho would come first to Bethany, then Bethphage, not the reverse. This is one of several passages showing that Mark knew little about Palestine. Well, let's read that passage again, shall we? When they drew near to Jerusalem, to Bethphage and Bethany, at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 of his disciples. Here's Tim McGrew going full gangsta up in here. He says that Mark doesn't say when they drew near to Jerusalem, they came first to Bethphage, then to Bethany. He's simply telling his readers approximately where it was on the road that Jesus sent his disciples on ahead. Bethphage and Bethany were both on the eastern slopes of the Mount of Olives, about half a mile from one another. Use some common sense. Feelings advisory, facts don't care. Sorry guys, I don't have special sound effects yet, but I did like that Tim's not pulling any punches. So let's move on to the next objection. On the way to Jerusalem, he was passing along between Samaria and Galilee. This is Luke 17:11. Joseph Fitzmyer, in his commentary on Luke, says this phrase enshrines Luke's geographical ineptitude. It is not easy to explain what is meant here. Whoa, ow. Luke is geographically inept, according to Fitzmyer. Well, let's take a look at Israel at the time of Jesus. This is 1st century AD. And if you look at the map, you see Perea on the right, and then there's Judea to the south, Samaria central, and Galilee to the north. And so why is Jesus seemingly taking the long way around? Well, if we know a little bit about history, going back to my friend here, Tim McGrew, he says that the Samaritans were actively hostile to the Jews, and according to Josephus in 52, they even killed some Jewish pilgrims from Galilee. In Luke 9:51, we know that the Samaritans refuse to even welcome Jesus because they see he intends to go to Jerusalem. It says that his face is set to go to Jerusalem, and there's some religious tensions there and some racial tensions there, and there's hostility. And so to travel east along the border would keep Jesus and his disciples near fresh water. Again, just some common sense knowledge here. And if we know a little bit about the historical context, this passage doesn't seem to be all that mysterious. Well, how about Luke 4:29? And it says, they rose up and drove him out of the town and brought him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built so they could throw him down from the cliff. Now, if you know the context a little bit here, Jesus was saying in the synagogue that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to preach the good news. And he was saying that he was the Messiah. And being that he grew up in Nazareth, they didn't like that, wanted to push him off the hill. And Jesus then also said, hey, Elijah went to the Gentiles, Elisha went to a Gentile person, and so you guys reject me, I'll go somewhere else. And then that really threw them into a tizzy. So Michael Wolter says in his commentary on Luke, the place which Jesus is led and from which he is to be thrown down is not topographically verifiable, and ancient Nazareth was not located on a mountain but in a high valley. The details regarding this are pure fiction. Ouch again. Well, here's a problem. Critics seem to assume that the scene of the event was on Mount Precipice, which is indeed 2 miles outside of the town. The Roman Catholic Church even recognizes that this is the site that Luke's referring to. The problem with this view is that the Mount of Precipitation is 2 miles away from the city, and this also happened on the Sabbath. They weren't likely to do that. Well, here's the Cambridge Bible Commentary, and they say the whereon refers to the hill, not the brow. Nazareth, is pictured here, nestles under the southern slopes of the hill. The cliff down which they wished to hurl him, because it was regarded as a form of stoning, was certainly not the so-called Mount of Precipitation, which is 2 miles distant and therefore more than a Sabbath day's journey, but one of the rocky escarpments of the hill. There's a fancy word for you, escarpments, and possibly that above the Maronite Church, which is about 40 feet high. Well, I did a little digging on Google, and here is that Maronite Church. And as you can see, the arrow points down to a bit of a big drop-off there, about 40 feet. Well, the median lethal distance for falls is 4 stories or 48 feet, according to Trauma Anesthesia, which is a medical textbook. And if they're throwing him headlong, they are obviously intending to kill him, even if it isn't a huge drop like we saw in the previous image. It's still good enough to seriously do some damage. So I don't think these objections are really all that strong. Well, what did they actually get right? What did the gospel authors get right? Forgive me for breaking every rule of PowerPoint here. And if you have to squint your eyes for this one, I apologize in advance. But here is a chart from Peter J. Williams' book, Can We Trust the Gospels, which I'll link in the description down below. Excellent, excellent book, especially chapter 3 is where I'm getting some of this information from. Now, look in all the towns that are listed. We have something that literally goes from A to Z and on to Zarephath. And we have big cities like Jerusalem and Jericho and Tyre and Sidon. And we have smaller cities like Enan and Chorazin and Cana and Nain that are listed. And so there's popular towns, there's smaller towns. Where do they get all this geographical information? We also have regions. Take a look at this list for just a moment. There's all of these different regions that different gospel writers list. Some of them are unique, and many of them list the same ones, like Galilee and Judea. So Peter J. Williams says, and again I'll link the book in the description, he says that all writers show a variety of types of geographical information, from the popular towns to the obscure. No gospel writer gains all of his knowledge from the other gospels, since they contain unique information, and all the writers show a variety of types of geographical information. There's a big distribution there. So how do they get this knowledge? Well, there's 3 main options. There's personal experience, which would make them eyewitnesses, and then there's hearing, which would make them have to hear of eyewitnesses, or there's research, reading. They did an incredible amount of research. Is that really likely? Well, no known sources hold together all the information that the gospel writers have, and it would have taken a huge level of research. Guess what? No Google back then, no Wikipedia. This would be very difficult for them to look up. So if it was from hearing, the reports that they heard must have been really precise, and the stories that were being told weren't known just for their good message about faith or the kingdom of God or what have you, but they included specific details. Now, compare this to the Gospel of Thomas and other apocryphal writings, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Philip, that were written in the 2nd century. The Gospel of Thomas, it mentions Judea once. And the Gospel of Thomas is many a critic's darling. And we have hardly any geographical details mentioned. The Gospel of Judas, it doesn't list a single location. The Gospel of Philip, we have 3 spots that are mentioned: Jordan, the Jordan River, Jerusalem, and Nazareth, where Jesus was from. Not really a whole lot of details. This makes sense if they were written a long time after the events and from far, far away. Now, what about bodies of water? It's interesting that John, the son of Zebedee, who historically Christians have believed written the gospel after his name, was a fisherman. Well, notice that he lists a bunch of different bodies of water, and the gospel writers list several bodies of water. It's interesting to note that the 3 local writers call the Sea of Galilee a sea, but it's a far cry from a sea. It's only 1/300th of the size of Lake Michigan. But Luke, who's from near the Mediterranean, he just calls it a lake. And so he's not really all that impressed, right? Makes sense. Well, the Gospels all know that Bethsaida and Capernaum are towns located by the Sea of Galilee. And Matthew and Mark know that one can go from the Sea of Galilee directly into a hill country. Matthew, Mark, and Luke know that there's a Judean desert near the Jordan. This is again from Peter J. Williams, and these are specific geographical details that the gospel writers are spot on about. What about the geography of roads? Well, the parable of the Good Samaritan gives us an example. Jesus tells us the story of a man going down from Jerusalem, which is 2,540 feet above sea level, to Jericho, which is 800 feet below sea level. So he knew about the elevations of Jerusalem and Jericho. All 4 Gospels describe people going up to Jerusalem and going down as they left Jerusalem. Well, this just makes sense. Now, you might say, well, these are 2 of the larger cities in the area that people would know more about. Okay, that's fine. Well, here's Luke 10:13, which says, "Woe to you, Chorazin, woe to you, Bethsaida, for if the miracles that were performed in you had been performed in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago, sitting in sackcloth and ashes." Well, a little-known fact of Chorazin, or a little-known village, I should say, of Chorazin, is in fact on the road to Bethsaida and just a couple miles north of Capernaum. As far as we know right now, there's not a single literary source that could have provided this information to the gospel author. So again, this shows some more preciseness to granular details, smaller details. What does all this mean? Well, it means that the writers were either acquainted with the land themselves, or they accurately recorded that which was reported by others and were acquainted with the land. It also means the information the writers had is consistent with what we would expect if the Gospels were written by their traditional authors. Not only that, but the resulting Gospels are not what we would expect from people who made up stories at a geographical distance. Now, I've lived in Missouri and I've lived in Iowa. If I was living in Missouri and never lived in Iowa and I had to make up a fictional story about Iowa with no Google, I could probably list Des Moines. I could probably list Cedar Rapids, which is where I'm located now. I could maybe think of like Waterloo and a handful of the other larger towns, which there is no real major booming metropolis in Iowa. And that's about it. I couldn't come up with Palo or Ottumwa and all of these other little smaller towns, Marion, Robbins, and different things like that. Nor could I come up with the different lakes and rivers in Iowa other than the major ones that I might know off the top of my head. I didn't know there was a Cedar River. Oh, that makes sense, Cedar Rapids. And so it just shows that the level of geographical information that we have is of a high quality when compared with the apocryphal Gospels is of a very sparse quality, and it shows that these people either knew their stuff from directly being in the land or they knew it from others and they were faithfully recording it. And so I hope this video helps Please consider supporting me on Patreon. It does help me to get better equipment and cover some of my hosting costs and different things like that for the website, which is listed there is JesusAlive.com, which you can check out. There's lots more there on the subject of historical apologetics and apologetics in general. Thank you so much for watching.